Hi, and welcome back to the Shane Plays White Plume Mountain Notes series as I take my party of intrepid adventurers through White Plume Mountain from Tales from the Yawning Portal. They've updated White Plume Mountain and several other classic adventures to 5th edition, so it's always a lot of fun in this adventure. It's a fun house adventure as it's been described. Doesn't always make a lot of logical sense or narrative sense, but we've been having a good time with it. So. Um, we'll recap what happened right after viewer feedback. And viewer feedback, actually, the very first viewer feedback is a feedback about viewer feedback. So if you normally skip viewer feedback, you may want to listen real quick on that. Just want to say if you're a continuing viewer, I appreciate you very much. And if you're a new viewer, thanks for checking out the channel. I hope you like it a lot. I try to, kind of give good notes on not only running White Plume Mountain, but rules, notes, kind of my approach as a DM, and that sort of thing. So with no further ado, let's put on our +3 spectacles of viewer feedback and get to the viewer feedback. So here we go. All right. So the very first viewer feedback is from my ex Falcon. Uh, and she said, "Hey Shane," or I'm assuming it's a she because of your avatar. If I'm getting that wrong, I apologize. "Hey Shane, I love your videos because I'm running Out of the Abyss and planning to put White Plume Mountain in as well. My other video series where I do this so far has been Out of the Abyss, if you're not aware. One request though, can you please put a timestamp as to where the session review starts? I understand that you want to have some viewer feedback, but I usually skip over those." Okay, so I appreciate your feedback. Thanks for letting me know. Uh, Basically, I'll say the same thing that I posted in the comments on video number 8. I'll try to start doing that. One thing I will say on the viewer feedback is a lot of times we revisit rules discussions in viewer feedback or handle certain adventure points, Uh, so it may be more interesting for running White Plume Mountain or Out of the Abyss than you might realize. So, uh, but that being said, if viewer feedback is not your thing, your cup of tea, you just want to get straight to the recap, that's totally cool. I'll start trying to put in uh, timestamps in the video comments is when the actual recap begins. Uh, One thing though, the video has to load, and then I have to come back to it and edit the video again to put that in. I think there may be a way for me to figure it out beforehand. But anyway, normally what happens is I get everything edited on Sunday night, and I started uploading and I go to bed. So it may be sometime Monday or whatever the next day is after the video's uploaded before I get a chance to go back and put the timestamp in. But I may be able to figure out, okay, the video URL is going to be this, and I know the time is this, so I may be able to front load it. We'll see. Anyway, thanks again for the feedback, and thanks for being a viewer of the channel. Um, Lynn Marlowe said, last session in his White Plume Mountain campaign, a dwarf barbarian critted twice in the same round, easily killing the vampire. And I'm like, wow, because that vampire is nasty. So if one character took that vampire out in the same round, wow. I just have to say that the dice must have fallen just perfect because that is a CR13 encounter, and that vampire is nasty. And we'll be talking about that vampire later in this video. But that's one of those once in a lifetime D&D moments where your dwarf barbarian player will be able to brag about that for the rest of his days. So kudos to him. Kudos and to him from Shane Place. Okay, Rob Plummer said it's easy to forget that the bag of holding has limits. In fact, until you said something, and we went over the bag of holding and the volume of it and everything last video. Until you said something here, I'd only been tracking weight with them, not volume. Guess I better check that now. So, yeah, I think a lot of us, and this is kind of what I said to Rob, we have our own headcanon to how the bag of holding works. I mean, way back when I first started playing D&D, I just think of it as this little brown or black sack, and it's just got this huge dark space inside of it, and stuff just kind of floats around in it. That's just kind of how I think of it. And of course, DMs can do what they want. You can house rule it however you want. But what I went into last week was kind of as the rules is written, it's 64 cubic feet. What's the shape, size, or whatever the volume shape of that 64 cubic feet is kind of what we went into, and what can and can't go into it if you're playing it that way. But it always weighs 15 pounds, and it can only hold 500 pounds of stuff in it at any given time, if I remember right. So anyway, he also said, Rob Plummer also said, I think you handled the golem situation correctly. I probably would have just had them activate. And I said, well, that would work too. So what we're talking about is one of my players, after like multiple blurted out and spoiled the golem puzzle. The 5 golems lined up with numbers on them. He spoiled that, and I had to kind of spontaneously figure out what am I going to do here. So Dawn Raum, I still hope I'm saying your last name, Dawn. And by the way, Dawn and I were hanging out in a Dawn Forged cast live stream the other day where he was talking about basically how to build your video channel on YouTube. It was a good cast, but Dawn saw me and said, hey. I was like, hey, Dawn. So thanks for saying hey, Dawn. And he said, I agree with you on how you handled the golem situation. It's hard to handle it when you're in the moment. I'm constantly looking back at one thing or another in my last session. How could I have done it different? But it's all about the fun, as you said. We're all humans. We all make mistakes. The only thing we can do is try not to make them in the future. Right. I agree, Don. Sometimes you just got to make a ruling and move on and hope you did the best and keep the game fun and try not to beat yourself up too bad. And if you have to change something in the future based on something you changed, just try to explain to your players, look, I know I said this one time, but here's why I'm changing things now. I hope you understand, I have a reason. I'm not just being arbitrary or on a whim. And then Don said, on a side note, I've been following your channel since you did a walkthrough of Sword Coast Legends PC game. It was really helpful. He was stuck in a couple of places and used my walkthrough to see what I did wrong. Keep up the good work, or what he did wrong. So you're welcome, Don. Yeah, I enjoy doing the Let's Plays. This channel started as kind of a Let's Play channel, and I was also starting to put my radio show, my live Geek Talk radio show up on here and everything. And I'm going to still do the Let's Plays because I enjoy doing them. But, I'm not a strong Let's Player. I can just tell. I mean, I get some videos that have a lot of views. But, the trend over time, like what really generates a lot of interest and engagement is not my Let's Play videos. But I will keep them up. And as a matter of fact, I'm still working through Sword Coast Legends, and I just put a new one up. So I'm glad you found the channel that way. It's good to hear that. So finally, Ethan D., remember, has Anti-Heroes Anonymous. You can go check out his streaming of his D&D campaign while they're doing White Plume Mountain. And he wrote a pretty long comment, so I'm not going to read everything here, but it's some good stuff. I'd recommend you go to video 8 and check out his comment. But he did mention a couple of things I want to throw in here. One, he talked about Hold Person, the spell, and I talked about this a little bit a video or two ago, where I was talking about, Hold Person can be disruptive if it's just used over and over and over, and how do you handle that without taking it away from the party? Because you don't just want to say, well, you can't use Hold Person. That's not cool, right? So he had a good point here. He said another important limitation of the spell is it only works on humanoids. So that may seem like a broad category, but it actually doesn't include as many creatures as you think. Some human-shaped creatures do not actually count as humanoids. Hags, vampires, and mind flayers are some good examples of that. They're human-shaped, right? But they're not humanoid as far as the creature type in their stat block description. And thus Hold Person will not work on them. So you need the 5th level spell, Hold Monster. And that's a very, very important distinction. Let's see. He talked about the Golem Room being a tough situation. He talked about if he had a character pushed in, he would still let the other characters on the outside hear the riddle being extended by the golems. And one reason I didn't do that was to show the consequence to the player who pushed. Like, man, you go pushing somebody into a room, it may seem funny and giggly out of character, but in character, that can have some consequences. So that's one of the reasons I did it that way. But also, I kind of ruled that the people on the outside of the room could hear a conversation going. They hear a voice talking to the rogue who had been pushed in, but they couldn't make out exactly what was being said. So that's kind of how I did it that way. He also pointed out Black Razor not being good against undead, and in fact, if you hit the vampire with Black Razor, you'll get some feedback and some damage because it's negative, it's necrotic, and Black Razor feeds on living energy. That actually came up in this session. So anyway, thanks so much, Ethan. Appreciate your comments. That's it for viewer feedback, and now we're going to dive into the recap of what happened in the most recent session. All right, so let's take off the +3 spectacles and/or glasses of viewer feedback and get into what happened last time. Now, I want to point out a couple of just general things that came up during the recap, just kind of rules points. I'll mention those, and then we'll get into the blow-by-blow, play-by-play, if you will. One thing that came up is one of my newer players wanted to keep trying an ability check over and over and over and over. Like, he failed it, so he's like, well, let me do it again. And I kind of said, unless it's a certain specific circumstance, you just can't keep doing an ability check over and over and over in normal circumstances. Because otherwise, it just means you're eventually, you just keep rolling. Oh, I failed. Roll, 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 and you're eventually going to hit. And if there's no negative consequence to failing the ability check, then you just keep rolling until you make it. And that's kind of hacking the game, if you will, a little bit, breaking the game. Now, there's some circumstances where maybe you can keep trying over and over, if like there's a negative consequence or there's a good narrative or story or just plain fun reason. But in general, and here's a good example, like you're trying to lift something heavy. You're like, oh, yeah, and you roll and you fail. I mean, you gave it your best effort. And you somebody say, I just can't get it, right? And then, well, I'm just going to roll again. I'm going to roll again and roll again. Well, sooner you're just going to flip it up. So what's the point of even having an ability check to roll it or to lift it? Now, some previous versions of D&D had take 20, which meant you were just going to give it your absolute best effort. You had plenty of time. You're okay. Let's do whatever it is you were trying to do, craft something or lift something or whatever, right? Whatever the ability check was. Then you just took 20 and you took 20. It was assumed you rolled a 20 and you added whatever your bonuses were, and that was considered your best effort, and you either did it or you didn't. Now, D&D 5e does not have take 20, but they do have what's called passive skill checks, and that is like passive perception, for example, where you just take 10. It's assumed you rolled a 10 and you add your bonuses to it or whatever. But that's on page 175 in the player's handbook. Here, I thought I had that bookmarked, but I guess not. So page 175, passive checks. Passive check is a special kind of ability check that doesn't involve any dice rolls. Such check can represent the average result for a task done repeatedly, such as searching for secret doors over and over again, or can be used when DM wants to secretly determine whether characters succeed at something without rolling a dice, such as noticing a hidden monster. So basically, then you just say 10. So like all these doors that are in White Plume Mountain that require a DC 15 check to open, you could just say, well, you can just make it a passive check if you want. You don't have to roll a dice, and you either all your normal modifiers will be 15 and above, and you can pop it open or not. We've been having fun with those doors though, because in a lot of cases, just by the die rolls, the strong can't get them open, and then some little wimpy character pops it open. So it's been kind of fun. But also on a passive check, if the character has advantage on a check, you add 5. For disadvantage, subtract 5. The game refers to passive check total as score. All right. Now, working together, there's also working together and group checks. Okay, so working together means that like somebody's like, I'm going to help you out with this. Like we're both going to try to solve this lock or whatever. this trap, just for an example, then the person with the highest natural ability than that rolls, but they get advantage, and the other people are just assumed to be kind of assisting them. So the character who's leading the effort, or the one with the highest ability modifier, can make an ability check with advantage, reflecting the help provided by the other characters. All right. A character can only provide help if the task is one that he or she could attempt alone. And then finally, group checks, and these are kind of rare, although we did have a few in Out of the Abyss. When a number of individuals are trying to accomplish something as a group, the DM might ask for a group ability check. In such situation, the characters who are skilled at a particular task help cover those who aren't. To make a group ability check, everyone in the group makes the ability check. If at least half the group succeeds, the whole group succeeds, otherwise the group fails. So that's, there's passive ability checks, checks with assistance, and then checks with like an entire group. And there's also a help ability that can only be used in combat. And I'm not going to go into that here, but there's a help ability or a help action that can only be done in combat, or if you're in initiative, in initiative orders and all that stuff. So another thing that came up with it was a poison vial. Somebody asked, how many pieces of ammo can I cover with a poison vial? And this is on the player's handbook, page 153, in the adventure and equipment area. You can coat one slashing or piercing weapon with a poison vial, or up to 3 pieces of ammunition, and the potency is 1 minute. And then finally, the last thing we talked about was that there was just kind of a rules clarification that came up, was when can you drop a concentration spell? Can it only be done on your turn? And if you look at the player's handbook, page 203 and 204, under concentration, you can end concentration at any time. It specifically says no action is required, so I'm ruling you can end it whenever. On somebody else's turn, it doesn't matter. It's not up anymore. So that's how I rule it. Now, to get back to the actual let's blow by blow of what happened. So they had just defeated the golems, they finally went up some stairs and got out of the water, and they came to area 6, and that's where there's that turnstile. And it's like a big gated door thing, with the interlocking teeth, and you can go one way, but it'll let you go one way but not the other. And you'll see these at like certain security checkpoints on like military bases. You'll see them like at ball games or something like that, arenas, so you might see them. But it allows controlled access, but blocks people going the other way. And so they just turn this corridor and there it is. And so they're like checking this turnstile out. Some people might call it a turnstile. And this thing allows passage to the east, but it blocks movement to the west. And it doesn't directly say this, but I'm assuming it's in case people are trying to flee the vampire fight that's later on. They run into this turnstile, and then here comes the vampire chasing them. I'm thinking that's what's there, because in a lot of circumstances, this vampire can be very, very deadly. So they were like checking this turnstile out. And remember, like, it's easy as a DM. You're like, it's just a turnstile. They go through it. They can't go through it the other way, and it's hard to get rid of. In fact, it says that it takes like a DC 24 strength check to rip it up or something. Let me see if I can find this. This is area 6. Yeah, a golem or a strong character could rip it out with a successful DC 24 strength athletics check. So, I mean, that would be one advantage to the golem from, room 5, area 5, because one of them, if you solve the puzzle right, then the golems don't attack, and one of them becomes like basically your ally, and it'll do whatever you tell it to do. You can just say, rip that turnstile out, and it could be like, and Hulk out on it. But our group did not get the golem. They had to fight the golems. So, so there's that. Now, but anyway, it's easy to remember. Like, all about it's just a mundane, really construction. But they're like, and they're like checking it out with Arcana, and one guy's thinking out loud like, once we go through this turnstile, it's going to put some kind of a magic effect on us or something. So it's always interesting to me to see how the players approach it. It's like, the unknown. Their imaginations just really get going. Uh, so that's one advantage players have over DMs. You know, they're like that. You know, wow, what's going to be next? Where you know what's going to be next, or can change things if you want, I guess, to make interesting things happen next. So uh, they check that out. They finally just decided to go through it. And what happens is they end up coming to another door. They get that open, and it opens into Area 7, which is the Geysers and Chains cavern. This is a very interesting area. It's a big, huge cavern. I think it goes 50 feet up, and then if I remember right, it's 50 feet down. Let me see here. Yeah, the door opens onto a stone platform in a large natural cave. Opposite the entrance in the distance is another stone platform. Between them, a series of wooden discs is suspended from the ceiling by massive steel chains. The cave floor seems to be covered by a pool of boiling mud. There are 9 discs, I believe. Let me count them up. I'm pretty sure it's 9. Uh, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, there's 9 wooden discs that I think that are 4 foot in diameter, and they're 3 foot apart each, separated by 3 feet, and they're hanging by chains from the cavern ceiling. And the artwork, all the artwork I've seen, both from the classic module and from the newer Tales of the Yawning Portal, or from the Yawning Portal, it kind of shows the discs going up to the next platform. However, the book states that the ceiling, or the cavern ceiling or whatever, is 50 feet above both platforms. So that would indicate that the platforms are level, which would indicate that the discs are not, going up. But that's how I described it to my characters, because that's what the artwork said, and that didn't really click to me that they were 50 feet, both 50 feet, below the ceiling. But I mean, you can make them go in an arch, or you can make them go up if you want. And be closer to the ceiling at the other end, whatever you want to do. I mean, it's a cooler visual if the discs are kind of going up almost like steps. Um, and the point of this room is, and what the characters don't know, is that in addition to navigating these discs and making it to the other end of the cavern safely, there are 2 geysers on either end of the room, not quite at each end, about, I think they're around the second or third disc out on each end side, but they're close to either end, and they erupt alternating at different times. One erupts every 5 minutes, one erupts every 3 minutes. The book specifies which. There's like a northern one and a southern one or whatever. And when these geysers go off, anybody in the cavern is going to take at least 1 damage, no matter what. Um, but the closer you are to the geysers, you could take significantly more damage than that. And you also have a chance of falling off one of the discs and plummeting into the mud below. So, pay very close attention to that. You know, I didn't sit there with a stopwatch and time, on my phone, or with a little stopwatch or anything, time 5 minutes versus 3 minutes. What I did is I rolled dice. I assigned values to both geysers. One was every 5 minutes, one's every 3 minutes. And I think I took a 10-sider for the every 5-minute one, because you could divide that evenly by 5. And I think I rolled, and I was like, if I roll a 10 or a 9 or 10, whatever a 5 would be, that one will erupt. And I took a 6-sider, and that's evenly divisible by 3. And I think if I roll a 6 or a 5 or 6 or whatever, that one will erupt. So I just kept rolling every now and then until I hit that on one of those dice, and that's the one that erupted first. So I kind of came at a random element, and then, I had them alternate. And I played a little fast and loose with when they both alternated again. I didn't say, well, it's 5 minutes, 3 minutes. I just kind of alternated them from there. And they both ended up erupting 2 times each. And it just adds a lot of interesting tension and drama to the scene, because they're trying to get across. And at first they just think that, well, we've got to figure out how to get across this cavern over this boiling mud. And then the geysers start erupting, and that they're like, whoa. And these geysers, again, the closer you are to it when it erupts, you take damage up to, the worst you can take is 5d10, an average of 27. And if you're on a disc, uh, that's if you're adjacent to the geyser when it blows, and then it's measured out, lessening damage by how far away you are in terms of discs, hanging disc, and then it gets down to just anywhere in the cavern is going to take at least 1d6 fire damage for an average of 3. Now you get a DC 15 dexterity saving throw, and if your character makes that, then they take half damage from it. But remember, they're going to take at least 1 damage no matter what, and that'll be kind of important here in a second. Um, Another thing that to keep in mind, if they're on one of these wooden discs with the chain, if they get caught in the geyser, then they have to make, if they're within 4 discs of the geyser, they have to make a strength dexterity check to hang onto the chain, and if they fail that, they plummet into the mud below. So, it's hard enough, hey, we got to get across these discs, and what they don't know at this point is once they get across, they confront a vampire. So there's every possibility they could be trying to flee back the other way, and the discs themselves would present, sort of a challenge. Hey, we got to move quick, and there's vampires on us. But you add these 2 geysers to it, and it could be kind of a crazy room. Now, the Tales from the Yawning Portal 5th edition version of White Plume Mountain mentioned that there's sort of this slimy algae slime kind of thing, slimy slime, that covers the walls and the ceiling and the chains, and it has a slight phosphorescent glow. The original White Plume Mountain module also says that the wooden discs are covered in that as well. So it's just kind of a slimy, somewhat dangerous area to begin with. And the slime causes, by the book, if you try to climb the chains or if you try to climb the walls and ceiling, then it requires a DC 15. Think strength check again, strength / athletic, or parentheses athletics. I would also allow that to be dexterity, acrobatics personally. But if you want to go by the book, it's just strength. If you want to climb the chains, or if you want to climb the walls or the ceiling and try to get across. Now, one thing that neither book, and the reason I even know about the algae being on, or the slime being on the disc, because I went back to the original module I'm like, I was reading the Tales from the Yawning Portal version of White Plume Mountain, the 5th edition version, and I was like, how hard is it just to get across the discs? And it doesn't say. So I went back to the original White Plume Mountain module, and it doesn't say. It just talks about, if a geyser erupts, how, you'll fall off, possibly. Or, climbing the chains of the ceilings is so hard, it's such a level of difficulty. But as far as just getting across the discs themselves, it's never stated. So I ruled that if a player is just moving normally, trying to get across the discs, then they can get across without a check, but it's a difficult terrain. So it's half movement, because they're kind of moving across, unless they have some sort of ability that lets, of course, if they can fly or something like that, it's a moot point. But or dimension doors, I don't know. But so if they were just, I'm going to work my way across, they could get across. But remember, there's a time factor here because of the geysers. So they probably don't want to just mosey across the discs. And in fact, that's kind of what started happening with my party. Is that they were really trying to move, even before they realized there were geysers, they were trying to move quick. So here's what I did. I just said, if you're dashing, if you're going to take a dash movement and try to get across these discs as quickly as possible, then I need a DC 10 strength, athletics, or DC 10 dexterity, acrobatics to get across. And because that's assuming they're really trying to move. And there's a little bit of slime and this and that. So, but if they were just not taking a dash movement, just taking a single movement action, then they could just move across like it was difficult terrain. Now, the difficult terrain didn't really come into it because we never went into initiative or combat in this area. Now, it's possible they, they're still fighting the vampires at the end of this session. I'll get into that. But on the way back, we may be in an initiative situation. But I had one character that had, Sir Bluto's boots of striding or leaping and striding or jumping or whatever, and he calculated, if I get a running jump, I can move this far and da da da. So he wanted to take a dash and do 2 jumps, And I said, okay, well, you can be on the very last disc, the ninth disc, right before the platform on the far side in one turn. I said, but in two jumps or whatever. But you need to give me. We were talking in turns, in terms of turns, even though they weren't really an initiative. And so I had him giving me two DC 15 dexterity checks because he's really, bound and landing and then bound. He's really moving quick, and he's got a high dexterity, so he made those fine. Another character was kind of working his way across when the geysers erupted. And then at that point, they were like, whoa, these geysers. And they were trying, because if you read the original poem that's given to the players as a handout, it's in the adventure. It's kind of a poem that's written about White Plume Mountain. It talks about twin somethings. Let me see if I can find this poem here real quick. Yeah, cross cavern vast where chain links rattle lies whelm past water spouts double. So they were trying to figure out, because there's another thing in the poem that says, to rescue wave you must do battle with the beast in the boiling bubble. So they saw that boiling lake of lava or mud underneath them, and they're like, oh, it's the beast of the boiling bubble. They're thinking, they started thinking in terms of about to have combat, but in reality, it's the water spouts double. And as soon as the geysers started erupting, they're like, oh, okay. And the poem, they're like, okay, so I guess we're on the way to whelm, because the poem basically tells you that. But basically between the jumping, spider climb, and the dwarf, who's the heaviest lifter, strongest character, having flight cast on them, they got everybody across. Now, some people took damage from geysers, but nobody went into the mud or anything like that. So that was good, because somebody probably would have died. So they managed to get across. Now, a couple of things I'll point out here. Again, it seems the danger of getting across the discs, if you're moving normally, is just from the geysers erupting, because you take damage and there's a chance of missing a saving throw and not holding onto the chain, plummeting into the mud below, the deadly mud below, which does quite a bit of damage. It does, I think, 8d10 per turn. Yeah, any creature that falls into the boiling mud takes 8d10, which is an average of 44 fire damage at the start of each of its turns for as long as it remains in the mud. So it plummets into the mud. That's not the beginning of its turn, so it doesn't take damage, but at the start of each turn after that, it takes 8d10 damage per turn that it's in the mud. That boiling hot, fantastically hot, scaldingly, dangerously hot mud. And that kind of damage being applied is probably going to kill most characters within a round or two. So it can be, it's not insta death, but it's pretty close. So another thing that came up in the using the flight spell was that one of my other players was like, well, what's the carrying capacity of that dwarf? And like I said, I usually don't get that detailed. I'm not that much of a stickler for like carrying capacity or this or that or how much ammunition you've used, unless there's a good story reason. But since it was brought up, I went, okay, well, let's calculate all that. So that's kind of what I tell my characters. I said, I'm usually not a super stickler on stuff, but if somebody's like, hey, these, I think these rules are interesting and I want to see, and I took the time to learn, I want to see how the rules work. And he really wasn't being a rules lawyer about it. He wasn't like, it's got to be like this, or he was just curious. He's like, what about the carrying capacity? So we stopped and calculated it, and the carrying capacity rules are on page 176 of the player's handbook, and it basically just says that you multiply your strength score by 15, and that's how much you can carry. And I went and researched other rules. Flying or the type of movement you have at that time does not affect your carrying capacity. If your carrying capacity is 300 pounds, that's 300 pounds whether you're walking, carrying stuff, or you're flying or swimming or whatever. So there you go. We did calculate that, and there was just a little bit of shifting around of equipment or whatever, but everybody was pretty much able to be carried across. One guy was had spider climb cast on them so they could book across. And remember, there's that DC 15 difficulty to get across the ceilings, walls, or chains, but with spider climb you get advantage, and they made it. Um, Another interesting, um, possibly deadly thing about this room to keep in mind: every time a geyser goes off, if you're in this room, if you're anywhere within the room or on either platform, you will take at least 1 point of damage. Whether you make your saving throw to have it, well, you're going to take at least 1 point of damage no matter where you're at. And that can affect concentration. And it also can affect familiars. In fact, you know, that owl familiar Barnaby that keeps coming up and it's like, I'm going to send them to scout ahead, and I'm going to send this and send that. You know, I won't root to kill players, but I'll root to kill familiars because, you know, they're just like got this great stuff lined up, and oh, I'm going to send a familiar ahead, and it totally spoils everything. And that's fine. The player can do that. It's one of the abilities they have to have in a familiar. But if a familiar bites the dust, I never shed a tear. I'm like, oh. So and in fact, the owl was flying around checking everything out, and the geyser erupted. In fact, the owl was the first. You know, the owl was like, and the geyser erupted, and the owl's like, boops, and just winks out of existence. And the gnome pixie, or not the gnome pixie, the gnome wizard, who's named Pyrite, was like, oh, and you know, was sad. But I was not sad. So I'm not out to get players, but I am out to get familiars. So just to say, because they're 9 times out of 10, they are a pretty good foil for the DM, and they're a low risk way for players to, you know, scout out ahead and spoil a potentially interesting encounter, you know, by the familiar checking everything out. But again, if that's one of the abilities that players has, and if they can get away with it, and they can, you know, use that familiar, fine. But if one of them dies, this is the smallest violin in the world playing My Heart Bleeds for You. So anyway, so that 1 point of damage, you know, she said that her owl familiar only had 1 hit point, so it was gone. And it also can affect concentration spells. Remember that like spider climb, flight, those kind of things are concentration. And as a matter of fact, um, a geyser erupted, and um, you know, the dwarf was flying the wizard. They were the last people coming across, and the geyser erupted, and you know, and they weren't all the way across yet, and if that wizard had failed its concentration check, because it forces you took damage, it forces a concentration check, then they would have plummeted into the mud below, unless somebody else intervened. And the dwarf may not have died immediately, but that gnome probably would have died pretty quick. So unless there was some kind of reaction spell she could have thrown. So just keep that in mind in this room, that, you know, familiars are pretty fragile in this room. Now I can't even remember off the top of my head if I don't think all familiars only have 1 hit point, but this owl only had 1 hit point, and it can also affect concentration spells. But the geyser erupted, and the wizard's flying. And one thing I did, because the wizard had the gnome and was flying, I only made the dwarf roll um, the dexterity to have the damage, because he was the one flying, and the gnome was just being carried. So, you know, that's just how I ruled it. Um, but anyway, he made it, and, you know, and she made her concentration check. So they were fine. So, like I said, there's a lot going on in this room. I would definitely recommend that you study it pretty closely before you run it, because there's a lot of moving parts and checks and this and that and the other thing that can happen in Area 7, the chains and geysers room. So the next thing that happens is they're going to come to Area 8, which is the vampire's lair. And under the coffin is Whelm, the Warhammer, which is the next big, you know, legendary weapon, the second of the 3. The other one is Wave the Trident, and they already have Black Razor. Now, once they all get across and they're on that further platform, the platform that's on the other side of the geyser cavern, then there's a door there, and that little platform's only a couple of characters can fit. So somebody's going to have to get that door open. People are going to have to start going in that corridor so everybody can fit, because not everybody can fit on that little platform in front of the door. So they get that open, they go in, And most corridors in White Plume Mountain are 10 foot wide, by 10 foot. This is I think it's 5 foot wide and still 10 foot tall. But keep in mind it's narrower, so they're going to go single file. That changes the dynamics of things. And this is I don't know, it's 40, 50 feet, something like that. Um, and so they've gone single file. And one thing they'll notice as they're going down this corridor that there's a little bit of mist fog kind of along, and this is what I ruled, that there's mist and fog along the bottom of this corridor, the floor, and it's kind of a dry ice effect kind of thing, and it's moving around and stuff in it, and it gets thicker the closer down the corridor you get until where they come to another door, I think 40, 50 feet down or something like that. This mist and the fog is, you need to go study, make sure to study very closely the vampire stab block. It's a CR13 encounter monster, and it's got a lot of abilities. It's a very dangerous, deadly enemy, but it's also one of its things is it has environmental effects around it, and one of those environmental effects is kind of fog and stuff around it. So they get down and they find this door, and they're checking out the door, which doesn't have traps or anything like that on that, but it has little pinholes all in it. It's just little holes all through the door. Think of almost like like when you see like a little container for a pet from a pet store, have little holes in it so they can breathe. But this is so the vampire can go in and out of the door in its mist form. Even if the door is closed, it doesn't matter. It can just get in and out in its mist form. Because a vampire can either be in its humanoid form, even though it's not a humanoid creature type, as we talked about earlier during viewer comments, or it can turn into a bat, big giant bat, or it can turn into a mist. So, in all three of those forms you need to be aware of. The vampire has several legendary abilities. It's got the ability to, I think, make 3 saving throws a day. It otherwise would have failed. It's got a charm attack. It's got a bite attack. It's got a melee attack. That bite attack can reduce hit point maximum. If the hit point maximum goes to 0, that creature dies or that character dies or whatever. It's got regeneration. When it bites somebody, it gets hit points back. It's got a lot of hit points to begin with. It gets like +4 modifiers on almost every ability. It's just nasty. Remember, it's a CR13. And the way I described it to the characters, it was it was dressed in kind of noble effects, noble outfit with a cape, but it was pale, right? And it was a he, is what I made it a he. Now this vampire is under a curse originally from Caraptus, but now whoever is in control of White Plume Mountain Dungeon, whether it's Caraptus or not, has put this vampire under a curse, and the vampire is cursed and must defend Whelm. So it hangs out sort of in a trance in room 8, but when adventurers start approaching, it senses that and it wakes up out of the trance or the sleep or whatever, and it will defend Whelm, and it's under a curse. So, and when you open up that door to room 8, it is in blackness. There's a darkness spell cast inside room 8 where the vampire's coffin is. And let's see, yeah, it just says the door opens into an area of utter blackness. The room beyond the door is the lair of a vampire named Satinmire. He is compelled by a curse to remain here in a trance except when aroused to defend his treasure, which lies in a niche in the floor under his coffin. The vampire automatically awakes at the approach of intruders. The room is affected by a darkness spell, which is the vampire is not hindered by because he has true sight. If the vampire needs to leave this area to pursue intruders, the door to his room is littered with tiny holes through which he can pass in mist form. If the magical darkness is dispelled, it renews again automatically at dawn. And I've got a lot of other stuff in the dungeon renewing automatically at dawn or whatever, as we've talked about before. So what I had happen was, remember, they're all single file. I think there were 7 characters. They're all lined up in front of this door. They got the door open. They just see utter pitch black. And they're like, huh. And eventually a couple of the characters went inside the utter pitch black, which opened up in the single file a couple of little spots for me to take advantage of. And now the party is separated. So let me be clear. Tactically, it's a better thing to have the party come into the room of darkness and have the vampire attack in there. Tactically, for the best advantage, the best dice rolls, this and that. Narratively, what I had happen, because I thought it was a great effect, was when a couple of the characters went in and that opened up a couple of squares in that single file line, I had the mist kind of and coalesce into a humanoid shape and then form into the vampire. And he says, "Welcome to my hell. May you never leave." Because remember, he's under a curse, so he doesn't want to be here. So again, it's a great dramatic effect, but the better tactical approach is the vampire attack inside the darkness. One other thing I did, the vampire has a Children of the Night ability where it can summon bats or rats if it's in a dungeon, or if it's out in the outdoors, it can summon wolves. And it takes, I think, 2, 4, so it's 1d4 rounds to get there, and then you roll 2d4 to see how many of these allies are coming. And what I had before he revealed himself, he used that ability to already get them on the way, and I rolled that 5 swarms of bats would be coming in one round, to make it tougher, because this party has been doing really, really, really well. So I'm not out to kill anybody, but I do want to challenge them. Because as somebody pointed out in the last video, in a way they're not really taking the dungeon seriously, because they did that thing where they got in the kayak and went across the frictionless floor and smashed themselves into the other wall just to see what would happen, right? So the fear of the dungeon is not really on them. So I think that's a good idea to ratchet up the suspense level and the danger level. So one other thing that came out of that was, the bats showed up on round 2 of the combat, and one of my players attempted to use a Ring of Animal Friendship against the bats, and I got to thinking, I went ahead and ruled initially that, I let them get saving throws and whatever. When I went back and read, and not only are bat swarms immune to charm and frightened, you can look that up in the monster manual, so it fizzled. I went back, and it didn't have a game effect because they got frightened, and then on round 3, on their next round, they would start reacting to that, but we didn't get to that point, as I'll explain later. So it didn't actually have an in-game effect. I just explained to the player later, your action with your Ring of Animal Friendship actually fizzled, because it has no effect on these bat swarms. And I'm curious, I want to do some more research. Do swarms count as individual beasts for targeting or for spell effects? I'm assuming they do, because they have their own stat block. I'm assuming they do, but if you have any thoughts on that, I'd love to hear them. Black Razor was used to hit the vampire, and right at the last second, Black Razor's like, no! But, Uzumaki, the Oriental fighter, she hit him with Black Razor anyway, because right at the last second, Black Razor's like, no, no, no! And then bam! So if the vampire had been down in hit points at that point, which he wasn't, he would have gotten some hit points back. But Uzumaki also took damage, which totally freaked the players. Like, what? And it's like, Black Razor punished me. And I said, well, I don't think you get the sense that Black Razor punished you, but that Black Razor was trying to, warn you, don't do that. And then we talked about negative and positive energy and all of that stuff. So there's been some bites. There's been some spider climbing. The vampire is very nasty, because he gets legendary actions where he can do movements and he can do attacks outside of his own round on other people's turns, at the end of other people's turns. So he gets to go on his own round, on his own turn, and then he can do stuff. I mean, he's a very nasty foe. Like I said, if I would have let him attack in the darkness, probably would have been a kill for sure on one of the players. But I just love that dramatic effect of him forming up out of the mist and, welcome to my hell, may you never leave. I just thought that was great. And there was a little bit of discussion, do we know if this is a vampire? And somebody rolled an Arcana check and is like, yep, that's a vampire. And I had a little moment when Black Razor was about to hit him. He kind of saw Black Razor coming, and he smiled. I said he smiled. He's like smirks, and you see one fang, and they're like, oh! So that was a lot of fun. And I appreciated them asking, do we know this is a vampire? Because we've been talking more and more about metagaming in the group. So I thought that was cool, and we handled it that way. But I said, yeah, he rolled, and I was like, yeah, this is a vampire. You definitely know it's an undead of some sort, but it's a vampire for sure. You knew it was an undead before you rolled. But there was a lot of fighting going on, and we had to stop. We actually went over time. We went almost 3 hours the other night. We usually go between 2 and 2.5 hours, but the store was closing, so we had to wrap. So we ended right at the end of round two, or yeah, turn two, round two of initiative or whatever. And that's not my preference, but sometimes time constraints require it, especially with a friendly local game store. But when I do that, I take notes, multiple photos of the map with everybody's positioning um, with my phone. And I take detailed notes. I keep the initiative sheet. It's just one big sheet of paper where I do all of my initiative and hit point notes on for each battle. When the battle's over, I throw it away. And I take really good notes on there so I can, when we start next week, I can just look and say, okay, I know where everything's at. I'm not going to miss little nuances and important points. And again, this is not my preference because, one, I like to end the session on a more complete note, not in the middle of a combat. And you could have next week somebody can't make it, so they were in the combat, but now they're not. Just so many different reasons. But two, it gives the players time to think and prepare for a week on their next movement, next action, next whatever, instead of a spontaneous reactions in that, ooh, that a fight should be. Sometimes you can't avoid it, but that's what happened this time around. So anyway, it's a tough fight, and it should be. So I encourage you to max out the vampire's abilities, really study the vampire head. A lot of great abilities, very tough opponent. But anyway, so that's what happened this week. Next week, we'll be right back in the middle of the fight with vampires, with the vampire and the bats and all that good stuff. And we will catch you next time on Shane Plays. Thanks so much for watching. Please leave this video a comment and a thumbs up. That helps me out tremendously. And we'll see you next time. Thanks.